Okay, hey everybody, welcome back to the Flip Flopperator Auditorium. I'm going to get better at saying that as the day goes on. Our next speaker is Sarah Levins, coming from Perth. So we had Philadelphia at one end of the time zones, and we have Perth now at I think the entire other end of the world. Sarah Levins is a data and AI consultant at Empired, and an alumni of the She Codes Plus program. She brings 6 years of experience as a travel agent with her into her first tech role, and loves creating personalized solutions to interesting problems. So I can't wait to hear what she's going to be talking about. So take it away, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi everybody. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you're all excited for this chat about chatbots. As I said, my name is Sarah, and I'm an associate consultant at Empire in the data and AI team. And today I'll be talking about chatbots from a beginner's perspective, with a focus on why designing them to feel human is so important. So, chatbots are essentially software that use conversation as their user interface. They allow you to interact with the program in the same way you would interact with another person, with natural language. They could be a little widget down the corner of a browser page, like the ATO website here. It could be Facebook Messenger, on Slack, or even via text. If you can interact with the program by sending it a message, it could be classified as a chatbot. But why would you bother building one? You can easily go to the ATO website and navigate to the page and answer all your boring tax questions there. I'd argue that being able to interact with an application via chat makes them more accessible to people that don't know how, can't, or just don't want to interact with your software. It lightens the load and takes the pressure of customer service teams and makes personalized service available 24/7. Now, this is invaluable to any business, as making customers feel valued and taken care of is key to increasing sales, customer retention, and just generating more business. But think of the last conversation you had with a chatbot. Was it good or bad? And the last bad one you had, what was missing or what made it a bad conversation? I would bet on the fact that it didn't answer your question correctly. It didn't understand you at certain times and just generally made you feel unheard or like you were talking to a brick wall. Do you ever get that feeling when you're talking to another human? Like I do, but probably a lot less often than you would get it with chatbots. I'd argue that you need to build a chatbot with the human abilities for conversation in mind in order to make them more effective and useful to their users. Think of a normal human interaction, like you're at a restaurant interacting with your waiter. From the waiter's perspective, they're talking to someone who's there to order food. They can hear you when you ask for a menu, and they can understand your request for a menu and then give you one. A lot of common FAQ chatbots have these abilities to know their purpose, take a simple question, and return the appropriate response in a single turn conversation. But can they ask your name, food allergies, reasons for visiting the restaurant, and then recall and use that information later in conversation and in further interactions? That human ability to remember things from conversation and then use that information to influence the interaction is something a lot of common chatbots are missing. Now, the context of a conversation refers to the purpose of the conversation and things that have happened in the past and how that should affect how the conversation progresses. To make chatbot conversations feel more human, they need to be built and trained with the ability to have memory and therefore use the context of the conversation and then use that in how they respond. So, in this talk, I'm going to cover how simple chatbots work, some strategies I've used to make them feel more contextual and feel more human, and some tools for you to get started on building your own. Now, my hope is that today you take away an appreciation of the value of a well-trained chatbot and some excitement about the possibilities of what you can make them do. So, as I said, I started my first tech role earlier this year. I transitioned into the industry from a 6 year career as a travel consultant in retail. So, my first project in my new team was building an FAQ chatbot for a human resources team. And this concept was really interesting to me because I had spent so long in travel being trained and training people on the sales process, which is how to ask the right questions in the right order to get the right information so we can get results for our clients. Now, the thought of being able to automate that process fascinated me, so I decided to try build one for myself and see if I could pour all my knowledge of destinations and holidays into a bot. Now, being fresh to the concept, I had no idea how they worked. So if you're new to them too, here is a brief rundown. Chatbots have a front end and a back end. The front end is like the star of the show, or what the user sees. It takes the user's message and sends it to the back end along with some kind of identifier about who the user is. I love a good analogy. So in my mind, it would be like the front end is a waiter at a restaurant who's taking the order from the customer and sending it to the kitchen, which is the back end. Now, this back end is just an API endpoint or a URL you can send messages to get a response. So when messages are received to this endpoint, they are processed using a dialogue management model. Now, this orchestrates the receiving of messages and determines how the chatbot will respond. This works in conjunction with a natural language understanding model, or an NLU model, which determines the meaning of the message. Now, this NLU model compares the meaning of new messages to meanings of other messages it has been trained on in the past. It finds the one it's most similar to and assigns that message's intent to the new message. Now, an intent is really important. It's the intended goal of the user message. Now, this is defined by the developer in code. You write intents for what you think users will say to your bot. So, for example, if it's an airline chatbot, your user intent would be things like change booking or pre-book seat. The message the model knows already has an assigned intent. The new message would then be assigned that same intent. If we go back to my handy dandy restaurant analogy, if the customer said, "Can I order a Hawaiian pizza?" the intent of that message would be order food. You can then use what we call entities to extract the subject of the message. So, entities are real world phrases or objects that relate to, real world objects and concepts. And in this example, that would be an Hawaiian pizza. These intents and entities are then used by the dialogue management model to determine what happens next. So this may be respond to a user, trigger a specific action like retrieving information from a database, or just simply asking the user for more information or clarity. And there are a lot of different types of chatbots. So when I started to think about the kind I wanted to build, I felt that this kind, the retrieval-based bots, suit my bot's purpose the most. They use a combination of predefined actions and responses and machine learning to know how to respond to messages. It's a really straightforward way to give my users information, but will also allow my bot to get better over time as it figured out exactly what my users would be using my bot for. So that's where we come to Python. Python was the first programming language I learned and therefore my go to. So I naturally started there when I started looking for ideas on how to get started. First, I looked at some natural language processing libraries in Python, such as NLTK and scikit-learn. These helped me become familiar with the process of how natural language processing works and how computers interpret words and phrases as data. A common method of NLP is to take messages, tokenize them, and turn them into vectors or numerical representations of their meaning. You can then use libraries of data to assign these words meanings as vectors so they can be compared with other ones. So to build a chatbot this way, you can define a function with NLTK. So in this case, this lem normalize function, and that reads the data, tokenizes it, and turns it into usable data. You can then use the vectorizer and cosine similarity functions from scikit-learn to calculate the vector meaning of the new message and then find the response that's the most similar. From there, you can run a simple script that runs on a loop, and you've got a new friend to talk to. As fun as all this is, it's very hard to make a smart chatbot this way. So I turned to more options. I found a lot of online tutorials that looked at Chatbot, which basically helps you make robust chatbots really quickly. You essentially create a bot by extending their chatbot class, train it with some libraries of data consisting of hundreds of thousands of predefined messages, and then you deploy it through something like a Flask app and use it as an endpoint for a chatbot widget in the browser or numerous other channels like Facebook Messenger or Slack. But with all these different frameworks and tutorials, I was getting a little lost. Like, none of these frameworks were living up to the full potential of what a retrieval based bot could do and seemed far too difficult to scale up once I wanted to create something a bit more complex. So I took a step back towards the fundamentals and I ended up completing the Data Camp Building Chatbots with Python course. Now, this course is run by Alan Nickel, who is the co founder of Rasa, which is what I ended up using as the backend for my travel recommendations bot. Now, Rasa is an open source natural language understanding model and dialogue engine. It worked best for me because it's a framework that allows me to plug and play with what I need. And you can start with something really simple, add more logic and conditions to it over time, and come up with something that's truly unique and specific for your use case. So they have a command line tool, and when you run the init function, you're given a basic file structure. The domain file is what I call the brain of the chatbot, and it's where you define all your intents and entities and any simple text responses that you may want to send your users. The data for your model is held in the data folder, of all places. NLU is a list of intents defined by messages or what we call user utterances. So they're examples of sentences your user may say when they intend a certain action to happen. The stories file are example conversations that your users might have with your bot, which helps the dialogue management model know where to take the conversation next. Actions.py is where you can define pre-built or customized Python script actions that you want your chatbot to do when they receive specific intents. And then finally, your config file is the soul of the chatbot. And it basically defines a pipeline of what your bot will do to every message it receives and policies it will apply to its logic when it goes to return those responses. And you can choose from a lot of different pre-made components in that pipeline that will change how your bot tokenizes incoming messages, classifies those intents, extracts entities, and then selects responses. Like every human being thinks and responds differently based on who they are. So why should a good chatbot be any different? So I could go around and play with these different components until my bot responded the way I liked. Now, with all these options, it became difficult to know where to start and a bit overwhelming. So I started with conversation design. What kind of conversations did I think my users were having? This was important because by planning this out in advance, I was able to hone in on what it was I wanted my bot to do. I couldn't build something that could answer all the world's questions straight off the bat. I wasn't that good, like I'm good, but not that good. I had to start small. So I made 3 simple stories in my stories file. One where someone asked for a recommendation and they were happy with the response. One where someone asked for a recommendation, they didn't like the response, so they had the opportunity to ask again, and they do. And finally, one where they chose to not ask again. The dialogue management system, or what they call RASA core, then uses these stories to choose which response to select next. These policies are basically the rules your bot checks before it returns a response. It can have a lot of different policies, and all messages are checked against them. The policy with the highest certainty wins out. So, for example, the memoization policy returns 100% certain if your user is following a path you've laid out in your stories file. Having more of these policies in place means your model takes longer to train, but your responses will most likely be more accurate. The next thing I did, I put some training data in the NLU file so my bot would know some intents for some common messages it may be sent. Now, instead of making an intent for each kind of holiday my user would ask for, like request beach holiday and request cruise holiday, I made one intent called request holiday, and that could apply to any holiday request. Because think about it, users can ask for different kinds of holidays in a very similar way, like, can you recommend me a beach holiday and can you recommend me a cruise holiday are pretty much the same sentence but require different searches and a different answer. I have one intent and then extract these holiday types as entities. And in my training data, I simply label those words as that specific entity and extract that specific value. I also provided it with a list of synonyms. So I didn't have to rewrite a ton of training data. I could provide the training data with one word and it would map those synonyms to those words. I defined the intents and entities I used in the domain file, along with a list of how my bot should respond to those intents. In here, I specified a few alternatives to each response so the bot could randomize what it was saying just to keep things fresh and a bit exciting. And finally, I declared my custom action, which I called holiday recommendation. This is defined in the actions file and essentially takes a category entity from the latest message that has received the holiday request intent. It extracts a random holiday recommendation from that category and then returns it as a text response. So then when I'm happy with what I've got, I use the train command to train the dialogue management model and the NLU model to generate a file. This is then used when you run the server and I can start the project and chat to my new friend who responds as expected. Yay. So at this point, I had an okay FAQ chatbot. And from there, there's a few things you can take away. Start with your chatbot's uh, conversational flow in mind. So this is going to ensure that you keep the scope of your chatbot small and you get something up and running as soon as possible without wasting too much time overcomplicating its abilities. Use less intents and then split them on entities. So this is going to reduce the amount of training data required and stops the bot from getting confused by user messages that sound similar but have different goals. And just find a tool that works for you. Rasa is straightforward, but by no means the easiest Python chatbot tool out there at the moment. Find the format that makes sense for you and build your bot for that specific case. Now, at this point, I had a bot who could listen and understand. It had the human ability to understand context in the form of very simple stories, but it definitely didn't feel like I was talking to a human. It wasn't giving me anything beyond what I couldn't get from a Google search for a beach holiday. And if I searched for a term it didn't know, it just flat out failed. Like if I strayed from the very two basic conversations I set, it failed my very low bar Turing test, so it was time to add some more context. But first, I needed to figure out what else I wanted my chatbot to be able to answer. Now, I'm from Perth, so when I was a travel agent, people would continuously come in and simply ask us for holidays to Bali. But what they're really after is a specific experience. Bali, you can do a lot of different things. You could have a relaxing beach holiday, a cultural experience. You could have a super hectic party trip or go to a silent yoga retreat. All these different things can happen on the one island, but they require you to book very different things. So, to be able to give my chatbot the ability to give good recommendations, it would have to find out what the person wanted to experience. And I needed to give it the ability to ask targeted questions, extract that required information as entities, store it, use it as a query for a database, and then return appropriate recommendations from there. So, first, I added a form policy to my bot's config file. A form called holiday form that would do the job. I'd also add it to my domain file. Now, a form in a chatbot works like any other kind of form you can think of. It's something that exists to be filled out with information. It's just that you're filling it out with conversation. In Rasa, forms can be used to fill slots. Now, slots are space in your dialogue management model's memory that can be used to store data and influence the conversation dialogue flow. So, for example, you could define a slot called category, and whenever an entity of the same name is extracted from a message, it would be stored in that slot. And forms can be used as part of your conversational design to keep the bot asking the right question until it has all the information it needs. So it runs on a loop. I defined the slots in the domain file, and I added another section to my actions file that will run while the user's filling out the form with the bot. Now, this validates the responses and extracts the specific entities that it needs to place them in the slots. I updated my holiday recommendation action to dynamically query a database of holiday recommendations based on those slot values. And I updated my stories to activate the form. Finally, I work some of those slot values I've defined into the responses, so the user knows what they've said has been taken into account when generating a recommendation. This is such an easy thing to do, but one of the most important, because feeling heard will not only make a person happy, but like the process and like the chatbot more. People don't buy things or recommend to their friends people they don't like. Chatbots are no different. So I'd given my chatbot the ability to remember and carry on a conversation over several turns. It was great, but that's because I was only asking it the same questions. And whenever I strayed too far from that path I gave it in the training data, it would error or respond unexpectedly. I needed a way for it to deal with what it didn't know. So to be able to get my bot to admit that it wasn't super confident with an answer, Rasa has something called a fallback policy that overrides the other policies when a certainty score of a prediction is under a specific threshold. I used this to get my bot to ask the user again if it wasn't at least 40% certain of what it was saying. I added a completely separate intent called out of scope, which I use for questions I think the bot will be asked, but know that it's not ready to handle yet. Instead of apologizing and replying with, oh, I'm sorry, I don't understand, I try and remind the user what the bot is capable of and offer suggestions of response formats that I know will work. So to summarize, I'd given my bot some context by creating a way for it to store information about the user and conversation in memory, and then use that over several turns and later in the conversation. I wrote my chatbot's response in a way that made the user feel heard by echoing back their preferences to them. And I'd also created a way for my bot to fail gracefully and make the user feel comfortable when it wasn't able to answer something they asked. Now, I really like my travel recommendations bot. It understands me and it recommends all the holidays I like because I wrote them. But it was at that point I realized I did, in fact, need friends because the only way to truly make a chatbot human is to let it learn from other humans. Now, there are a lot of places you can put your chatbot. With Rasa, you can simply deploy the NLU and core by themselves and embed them directly in channels like Facebook Messenger and Slack. but I opted to deploy it with Rasa X and just use the REST channel so I could embed it on any site. Now, Rasa X is basically a UI that you can use to interact with and train and develop your chatbot. I deployed it to a server with Docker Compose, and this allowed me to link it up with my Rasa code on GitHub so I could easily release new versions as I train it more and roll back versions if they respond unexpectedly. In the Rasa X UI, you can chat with your bot and train it interactively. You can generate testing links and send them to controlled users so you can start training it as early as possible, and then review those conversations to correct responses and add it directly to your training data. You can view and manage multiple versions of your NLU model and roll back to previous versions if the changes you make generate unexpected results. And you can add stories and change policies in your pipeline on the fly in this quite graphic interface. Now, this is an invaluable tool because it allows you to get your bot out there quickly and into the hands of people it can learn from. Now, as I said earlier, I may have over 6 years experience as a travel consultant, but I've only got 6 months in experience in the tech industry. I'm a beginner and I'll be the first to admit my bot doesn't work great yet. So getting it into the hands of users who can give it more data to learn from is key to making it feel human, and my bot is still going through that process. I've sent it out to some friends who've done an amazing job of testing it and helped me debug holes in its logic. This way you can learn ways of saying things that you would never think of by yourself. But most importantly, you can pick up on some use cases and scenarios that users would want or expect from your bot, which is a great way to map out how you want to develop it going forward. If you've got time and you want to think about where you want to go when we can travel next, I'd encourage you to ask it some questions. And it's not at a stage where it's going to be of much help, but hey, you can't go anywhere anyway. So if you want to talk about it, go talk to it and help me make it better. Now, controversial, I know, but humans are better than chatbots. The hill I will die on is that I always and will forever use a travel agent. They save you time, worry, headaches. They can offer you recommendations and insights that you would never be able to find online, no matter how many TripAdvisor reviews you sift through. In any industry, booking and dealing with a human just feels better because you get validation for your questions and choices. Bad customer service aside, talking to someone does feel a hell of a lot better than sifting through pages and pages of information online. Therefore, if you're making chatbots for customers, aim to make them feel more human. Build your users a friend. These points I've covered are great things to keep in mind when building conversational AI. Implementing these strategies at the ground level will save you a lot of time down the road once it's time to scale your bot up. Now, chatbots are very time consuming and expensive to build, but they have so much potential and value. I'm always aware of the implications of automating jobs and what that means to industries and employees that rely on them for their livelihood. But I don't think that should stop us from exploring the possibilities of all the cool things we can do with accessible programming languages like Python and accessible concepts like conversational AI. So that's it. Thank you so much for joining today. Now, the code for the chatbot I built, along with some links to where you can go chat to it and references, can be found on my GitHub at the link here. I would like to thank my brother, Michael, for all his amazing chatbot drawings. And if you have any questions, I will be out in the hallway.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was awesome. And I'm pretty sure I speak for everyone in the chat room when I say that the illustrations were spectacular. So did you just say that your brother had a hand in those?
Yes, he did. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's pretty
pass
good.
that on. They
Yeah.
were amazing. We love them. Thank you so much. We have a bit of a break now. Coming up next at 11:35, we have everything you need to know about GitHub Actions. So get up, have a wee stretch, and we'll see you back here in about 11 minutes. Cool. See you soon.